Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that feels like it came straight out of a blockbuster action movie, but with way more ancient drama and bloodshed. Picture this, two massive powers, each with its own ambitions, resources, and armies, clashing for dominance over the Mediterranean. On one side, you've got Rome, still a growing empire, with its eyes set on expansion. And on the other side, Carthage, a wealthy and powerful city-state that controls the seas like a boss. It's 264 BCE, and what's about to unfold is a series of battles that will make your average family feud look like a playground scuffle. The Punic-Wars, my friends, are the stuff of legend. These wars aren't just about men with swords and shields, they're about grand strategies, military brilliance, and a thirst for power. It's not an easy story to tell, and certainly not one you'd want to be a part of. In fact, you probably won't survive this, just putting that out there. But before you get too comfortable in your chair, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. At the heart of the Punic Wars lies the conflict between two of the ancient world's most formidable powers, Rome and Carthage. But how did it get to this point? How did two such different civilizations come to blows? Well, let's rewind a bit and look at the landscape that set the stage for this clash of titans. Rome, at this time, is a rising power in the Mediterranean world. The city itself, founded in the 8th century BCE, has been growing steadily over the centuries, expanding from its humble beginnings as a monarchy to a republic governed by elected officials. By the mid-3rd century BCE, Rome has solidified its position as a major power in Italy, having conquered much of the Italian peninsula. Still, it's not yet the empire we think of when we hear the name today. In fact, Rome's ambitions are just beginning to stir. Rome's Senate and consuls are gearing up for something much larger than local skirmishes. Carthage, meanwhile, stands in stark contrast to Rome. Located on the north coast of Africa, in what is now Tunisia, Carthage was once a Phoenician colony. It grew into a powerful trading city-state that dominated the western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians were expert sailors, merchants, and naval warriors, and their vast wealth and control over the seas made them a fearsome force. With a strong naval fleet, they held sway over key trade routes, making them prosperous and influential. But the Carthaginians weren't just about trade, they had a formidable military as well, including mercenaries from various cultures, and they were no strangers to warfare. They had fought and won against the Greeks, Egyptians, and various Berber tribes in Africa. Still, Carthage had one main weakness: its land forces. While they were powerful at sea, they were relatively weaker compared to the growing might of Rome's legions. So, how do these two powers, Rome, a land-based force hungry for expansion, and Carthage, a naval powerhouse ruling the seas, find themselves at odds? It all boils down to one thing: Sicily. Sicily was a vital strategic location in the Mediterranean, and both Rome and Carthage had interests there. The island was home to a mix of Greek colonies, native Sicilian tribes, and even some Carthaginian settlers. But it wasn't just a peaceful crossroads for trade. Sicily was also a prize, one that would give the victor control over the western Mediterranean's most crucial shipping routes and, ultimately, access to the wealth of the East. In 264 BCE, the situation escalated when a conflict broke out between the Greek city-state of Syracuse, which controlled the eastern part of Sicily, and the native Sicilian tribes in the west. Carthage, already established in the western part of the island, had a stake in maintaining control. Rome, seeking to expand its influence, saw an opportunity to intervene. Both powers decided to send military aid to different sides in the conflict, and what began as a small dispute quickly turned into the first major confrontation between these two Mediterranean giants. Rome, with its large, disciplined army, was no stranger to warfare, but it had never fought a naval battle of this scale. Carthage, on the other hand, was a naval powerhouse, with a fleet unrivaled in the Mediterranean. The Romans had to quickly adapt. They had an army, sure, but they lacked the navy to control the seas. So, they did what Rome does best: they innovated. The Romans borrowed Carthaginian ship designs and added a unique touch: the corvus, a boarding device that allowed their soldiers to board enemy ships and fight hand-to-hand combat. In a way, the Romans took the Carthaginian advantage and made it their own. The First Punic War was a drawn-out affair, lasting from 264 BCE to 241 BCE. It wasn't a war of epic, decisive battles at first; instead, it was a war of attrition. The Carthaginians initially had the advantage on the seas, but Rome's ability to quickly learn and adapt, coupled with its relentless land-based military strength, gradually turned the tide. In the end, Rome managed to take control of Sicily, forcing Carthage to surrender the island. But this was only the beginning. Rome, having tasted victory and with a thirst for more, would not rest. And Carthage, having lost its stronghold in Sicily, now had a vendetta. This was a dangerous moment in history. Both empires were about to enter into an intense rivalry that would stretch over nearly a century. So, in a way, the First Punic War set the stage for a much larger conflict, one that would shape the future of the entire Mediterranean. Rome was now a recognized power in the region, and Carthage, with its bruised pride, was stewing over its defeat. It was only a matter of time before the two would clash again. And when they did, it would be a fight to the death. Let's take a step back and zoom in on Carthage, the power that had been Rome's rival since the very first clash in the Punic Wars. The Carthaginians were no pushovers; they were a civilization that ruled the Mediterranean like a master mariner. They were masters of the sea, and their influence stretched across vast territories, all from their mighty city-state, located in modern-day Tunisia. This wasn't just a place of incredible wealth and culture, it was an industrial powerhouse with one goal: to dominate the seas. And they nearly succeeded. You might not know this, but the ancient Carthaginians were also the first people to use iron anchors. They were not just naval innovators, they were trendsetters. Carthage's rise to power began when it was founded as a Phoenician colony in the 9th century BCE. The Phoenicians themselves were a seafaring people, with a knack for trading and navigating the open waters. Carthage, built on the remnants of their ancestors' knowledge, quickly became a commercial empire. Its harbor, with its massive ships and intricate infrastructure, allowed the city to become the dominant trade hub in the western Mediterranean. The city had a carefully planned urban landscape; its military fortifications, massive walls, and harbors were designed to keep its enemies at bay. The Carthaginian navy was the centerpiece of this power. Their fleet was a force to be reckoned with, sleek, fast, and formidable. At its peak, Carthage's navy boasted some of the largest warships in the Mediterranean, and it was capable of projecting power over vast distances. But their power wasn't just in their ships, it was also in the minds of their leaders. Unlike the Romans, who leaned heavily on their disciplined legions, Carthage relied on a mercenary-based military force. Soldiers came from all over the known world, from Spain, from Gaul, from Numidia in North Africa, and from even farther afield. This diverse army gave Carthage an advantage in flexibility but also posed a challenge when it came to loyalty and coordination. But what really made Carthage a force to be reckoned with wasn't just their military might, it was their wealth. Carthage controlled the most profitable trade routes of the ancient world. Its merchants traded everything from grain and timber to gold, silver, and rare luxury goods. The city itself was rich with resources, but it was also strategic in the way it used those resources. Wealth allowed Carthage to maintain a strong navy, build fortifications, and offer lavish rewards to its generals and soldiers. They didn't just fight for their leaders, they fought for the spoils of a thriving empire. So, Carthage wasn't just a city-state. It was a civilization built on trade, innovation, and naval supremacy. It was a powerful force that could bring wealth to its citizens and strike fear into its enemies. However, there was a dark side to Carthage's success, a side that would come back to haunt them in the end. Now, let's talk about their rival, Rome. While Carthage had the sea, Rome had the land. Rome, a relatively young power by the time the Punic Wars began, had grown from a small settlement on the Tiber River into a major regional player. By the time the First Punic War began, Rome was the dominant force on the Italian peninsula, and its armies had been trained for generations to conquer and expand. But Rome was not an empire by any means, not yet. At this stage, Rome was still expanding into its neighbors, solidifying its power in Italy. One of the key elements that set Rome apart from other civilizations was its legions. Roman legions were known for their discipline, organization, and strength in battle. They fought in a highly coordinated way, with each soldier knowing their place within the larger structure. But their success didn't come from just good training and structure, it came from their adaptability. Over the centuries, the Romans had fine-tuned their military strategies to deal with various kinds of enemies, from wild Gauls to disciplined Greek hoplites. Roman generals also had the ability to innovate. They were able to quickly adapt their strategies depending on the situation they faced. Unlike the Carthaginians, who were often reliant on mercenaries, Rome's soldiers were loyal to their city, and that loyalty translated into a fierce determination to win, no matter the odds. The Roman political system, with its complex network of consuls, senators, and assemblies, could be frustrating to outsiders, but it also meant that Rome was always governed by a system that valued strategic thinking, tactical expertise, and a long-term vision. The Romans were, however, not without their faults. Their army was not particularly skilled in naval warfare, yet. Rome's navy was still in its infancy, and even though the Romans were known for their resourcefulness, the seas were a different beast altogether. As we saw in the First Punic War, the Romans were forced to quickly learn how to fight at sea, building a fleet that could rival Carthage's dominance. The Romans knew that to survive, and to conquer, they would need to learn the intricacies of naval warfare. It's a little hard to picture, but imagine this: Rome, a land-based power, suddenly launching into the world of naval warfare, with its soldiers now needing to learn the ropes of sailing and ship combat. The Carthaginians, who had been on the seas for centuries, must have thought this was a passing phase. Surely, Rome couldn't compete with their superior naval experience. But they underestimated the Romans' ability to adapt quickly. The early phases of the Punic Wars were a series of trial and error for Rome. Rome's first major challenge in the war wasn't the Carthaginian army on land, it was the sea. In fact, most of the battles in the early stages of the conflict took place on the water, with Rome struggling to build a fleet capable of standing up to Carthage's seasoned navy. This naval gap was huge, and Rome's military planners had to scramble. But, as is the Roman way, they made it work. They adapted, learned from their mistakes, and slowly but surely began to carve out a place on the seas. Despite these early setbacks, Rome's persistence paid off. They fought hard, innovated when necessary, and slowly, ever so slowly, began to wear down the Carthaginian fleet. This wasn't an overnight victory for Rome. No, it took years, more than a decade of battling at sea, followed by years of brutal land engagements in Sicily. But in the end, Rome won. Carthage was forced to surrender its control over Sicily, a huge blow to their prestige and power in the Mediterranean. For the Romans, this victory marked the beginning of their rise as a major Mediterranean power. But for Carthage, it was only the beginning of a much larger, much more personal conflict. Let's shift our focus a bit and turn the spotlight on Rome during this period. The Roman Republic was still in its relative infancy, compared to the mighty empire that would later dominate the known world. The city of Rome itself, perched on the banks of the Tiber River, had grown over the centuries from a modest village into a powerful regional force. At this point, in the mid-3rd century BCE, Rome had united most of Italy under its rule, but it wasn't yet the world-conquering empire it would eventually become. The Romans had a unique political system for the time, one that blended elements of democracy and oligarchy. Citizens could vote in elections for consuls, magistrates, and other officials, but the real power lay with the Senate, a body made up of the city's elite families. The Senate controlled much of Rome's foreign policy and military decisions, and this powerful group had a say in just about every major action the Republic took. However, the Senate wasn't just a passive body of old men, they were also practical strategists, experienced in both warfare and diplomacy. When Rome entered the First Punic War, they were stepping into uncharted territory, particularly when it came to naval combat. Rome's armies had been undefeated on land for centuries, thanks to their highly disciplined and well-organized legions. But this was a new challenge. Rome had never faced a naval power quite like Carthage. While Carthage dominated the seas with its expert sailors and highly specialized ships, Rome's forces were better suited for land battles, not sea combat. At this point, it might seem like Rome had bitten off more than it could chew. Carthage had control of the Mediterranean trade routes, while Rome only had a relatively small, underdeveloped navy. Yet, the Romans were nothing if not persistent. This small city-state, with its deep-seated military culture, had a knack for innovation. Rather than trying to match Carthage's naval tactics head-on, they decided to learn from their mistakes, and, more importantly, to turn the tide in their favor. One of the most famous innovations was the corvus, a kind of boarding device that allowed Roman soldiers to board enemy ships and fight hand-to-hand. The corvus was a game-changer. Instead of relying on naval maneuvers, the Romans made sea battles a land battle. This shift in strategy allowed the Romans to neutralize Carthage's superior naval tactics and turn the war into something they were better equipped to handle. The Romans' ability to adapt and innovate was one of the defining factors of their military success. But it wasn't just the corvus that made Rome successful. The Roman military had an inherent flexibility built into its structure. The Roman army, made up of legions, was highly modular, with smaller units able to adapt to different kinds of terrain and warfare. This flexibility meant that Rome's army could quickly shift from one kind of battle to another, something the Carthaginians couldn't always do. But let's not forget that Rome didn't just become a naval power overnight. The process of developing a fleet capable of standing toe-to-toe with Carthage was long and arduous. Rome had to quickly learn everything from shipbuilding to naval tactics. And they did it in record time. By the time the First Punic War reached its final stages, Rome had not only caught up with Carthage but was on the verge of overtaking them. As Rome adapted to the naval battle, it was also starting to flex its muscles on land. In Sicily, Roman legions clashed with Carthaginian forces, and the war began to stretch on. This was a brutal conflict, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but the Romans proved to be more resilient. They didn't give up easily. Carthage, on the other hand, had a far more fragile military structure. The Carthaginian army was made up of hired mercenaries, and while these soldiers were skilled, they were also motivated by the promise of payment, not loyalty. This lack of cohesion would prove to be a critical weakness in the years to come. Over the course of the war, Rome's persistence paid off. Slowly but surely, they wore down Carthage's ability to fight. By 241 BCE, after nearly 20 years of bloody fighting, Carthage was forced to make peace. The war ended with Carthage surrendering control of Sicily to Rome. For the Romans, this was a massive victory. They had proven that they could not only compete with Carthage but that they could best them. Sicily, an incredibly important island in the Mediterranean, was now under Roman control. The Romans had won their first overseas conquest, and they weren't about to stop there. But what was the real cost of this victory? Sure, Rome had taken Sicily, but the war had been incredibly costly. The Romans had lost thousands of soldiers, and the war had drained the Republic's resources. Rome's leadership had shown its resilience, but it was clear that they had paid a heavy price. Carthage, meanwhile, was weakened but still alive. They had lost Sicily, but their navy still ruled the seas. Their military might have been tested, but they hadn't been completely crushed. The First Punic War had set the stage for the next phase in the rivalry between Rome and Carthage. Rome had emerged victorious, but Carthage wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. Both sides would have time to recover, and as we all know, Rome's thirst for conquest would only grow stronger. Carthage would rebuild its strength, and soon enough, the two powers would be back at it, this time, with even more to lose. The Second Punic War would prove to be an entirely different kind of conflict, one that would test both civilizations to their limits. But for now, Rome had secured a victory. Carthage, on the other hand, was left to lick its wounds and plot its next move. Both sides were preparing for the inevitable clash that was coming, and it was going to be a doozy. The First Punic War had barely come to a close when the ground began to shift under the feet of both Rome and Carthage. While Rome had managed to wrest control of Sicily from Carthage, the victory wasn't as clear-cut as it may have seemed. Rome, despite its triumph, was still a growing power, and even though the Carthaginians were now defeated, they were by no means out of the game. Carthage's response to its loss in Sicily wasn't to sulk in the shadows but rather to look for opportunities elsewhere, and they found one in Spain. The Second Punic War, which would begin in 218 BCE, would turn out to be far more devastating than the first. For the Carthaginians, it was about redemption. For Rome, it was about proving that they could maintain their newfound power and control, especially with such a dangerous rival still lurking. And what better way to do that than to turn the war into something personal? It wasn't just about territories anymore, it was about revenge, honor, and reasserting dominance in the Mediterranean. At the heart of Carthage's revival was one man, Hannibal Barca. If you don't know this name yet, you will. Hannibal was not only one of the most brilliant military commanders in history, he would come to symbolize Carthage's last stand against Rome. His story is as much about the weight of a family legacy as it is about his unmatched genius on the battlefield. Hannibal was born into a time of war and conflict. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had fought and lost the First Punic War, and Hannibal's youth was marked by the burning desire to avenge his family's loss and to restore Carthage's honor. According to legend, when Hannibal was just a young boy, his father made him swear an oath of hatred against Rome. Whether or not the story is entirely true is debated by historians, but there's no denying that Hannibal's hatred for Rome was real. It became his life's mission to strike back and make the Romans pay for their conquest of Sicily. As Hannibal grew into a young man, he was groomed to lead Carthage's military forces. He was a natural strategist, understanding not only the art of war but also the psychological components of leadership. He knew that war was about more than just winning battles, it was about demoralizing the enemy, breaking their spirit, and making them fear you. His early experiences, watching his father and older brother lead the Carthaginian forces, shaped him into the kind of general who would go down in history for daring to face Rome in a way no one had before. In the early years of the Second Punic War, Carthage set its sights on Spain, which had significant strategic importance. Spain was rich in resources, particularly silver, and it was a place where Carthage could recruit new forces to bolster its army. By 219 BCE, Hannibal had already launched an offensive, capturing the Roman allied city of Saguntum, which lay along the eastern coast of Spain. This event sparked the beginning of the Second Punic War. Rome, deeply offended by this action, declared war on Carthage, but Hannibal was prepared. Rather than sticking to the traditional military strategies that most generals would have followed, he chose an audacious route, one that would defy all expectations. Rather than attacking Roman territories directly, Hannibal decided to march his army from Spain to Italy, through the Alps. Now, to put this into perspective, this was no small feat. Hannibal had an army of tens of thousands of men, plus a herd of elephants that would have to make this perilous journey. The Alps were an inhospitable place, full of dangers that most armies would have avoided at all costs. But Hannibal wasn't just any general, he was determined, and he was thinking several moves ahead. The journey was incredibly difficult. Hannibal's army faced freezing temperatures, treacherous mountain paths, and attacks from local tribes. The elephants, yes, elephants, had an especially tough time, and many of them didn't make it across. But Hannibal and his men managed to persevere, and after a harrowing trek, they descended into northern Italy in 218 BCE. The Romans were stunned. They had never expected an army to make it across the Alps, let alone one with such a large force and war elephants in tow. It was a bold, almost reckless move, but it was precisely the kind of surprise attack Hannibal was known for. This bold strategy set the tone for the entire war. Hannibal didn't want to win battles by merely defeating the Roman armies in the field. No, his true genius was in his ability to create chaos and confusion, to pull the Romans into a war of attrition that would break their spirit and make them question their invincibility. And so, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic, high-stakes conflicts in ancient history. The Second Punic War was a war of not just military engagement but also sheer willpower. Both sides understood that the outcome of the conflict would decide the fate of the Mediterranean world. If Carthage won, it could reclaim its dominance over the region. If Rome lost, it might never recover its reputation as the leading power in the Mediterranean. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Rome, however, wasn't as unprepared as it might have seemed. While Hannibal's arrival in Italy took the Romans by surprise, they quickly regrouped. Rome's army was huge and well-trained. More importantly, the Roman people were united by the idea that their city was the heart of civilization, and they would fight tooth and nail to defend it. The Senate, although initially shocked by Hannibal's success, rallied behind their generals and started organizing their forces to confront the Carthaginian threat head-on. They weren't about to let a single general, no matter how brilliant, take them down. The Second Punic War would be a series of dramatic battles, where Rome would experience both its darkest hour and some of its most heroic moments. As we move forward, we'll see just how far Hannibal would push Rome, how, despite his brilliance, he would face challenges that not even his genius could overcome. And as for Rome, well, they weren't going to take this lying down. They were gearing up for what would soon become one of the most decisive military showdowns in history. Hannibal Barca's bold and audacious decision to march his army across the Alps would go down in history as one of the most remarkable military feats ever accomplished. Yet, The path he had taken was not only about overcoming geographical barriers but about showcasing his sheer will and determination to break the Roman spirit. The Romans, when they first learned of Hannibal's crossing, were utterly dumbfounded. Their own armies had never even considered crossing such a treacherous mountain range. The Alps had long been seen as a natural barrier that would deter any enemy, but Hannibal had not only crossed it, he had brought an entire army, along with war elephants, through this forbidding terrain. His strategic audacity had already begun to shift the tide of the war. At this point in the Second Punic War, Rome had no choice but to face Hannibal directly. It wasn't just a matter of reclaiming territory, it was about protecting the very heart of the Roman Republic. Rome's reputation, its strength, and its entire military system were now on the line. Hannibal's arrival in Italy wasn't just an invasion, it was a direct challenge to Rome's identity. Rome had always prided itself on being an unstoppable force, the conqueror of Italy. To have a foreign army march into their own territory, so brazenly, threatened everything Rome had built. So, what did Rome do in response? They didn't just retreat into their city and wait for reinforcements. They mobilized. They gathered their legions, under the leadership of their generals, to confront this seemingly unstoppable Carthaginian force. The first major clash would come soon after Hannibal's descent from the Alps, and it would set the stage for one of the most famous battles in history, the Battle of Trebia. The Battle of Trebia, fought in 218 BCE, was Hannibal's first major engagement with the Roman army after his arrival in Italy. The Romans, with their superior numbers and renowned military discipline, believed that they could crush the Carthaginians. They had no reason to think otherwise. After all, Rome had never truly faced defeat on such a scale before. However, Hannibal was a master at understanding the terrain, and he knew exactly how to exploit Roman weaknesses. His knowledge of the landscape, coupled with his psychological warfare tactics, allowed him to create a situation where the Romans were forced to fight on his terms. At Trebia, Hannibal's forces made use of clever deception. He stationed a portion of his army hidden in the hills and used the cold, snowy winter weather to his advantage. When the Romans advanced, they fell right into his trap. As the Roman soldiers crossed the river Trebia, fatigued and caught in the cold, Hannibal's forces struck from the hills. The Romans were not only surprised but exhausted and disoriented. What followed was a crushing defeat for the Romans, with around 25,000 of their men lost. This wasn't just a military loss, it was a psychological blow. Hannibal had shown the Romans that they could be defeated in their own backyard. But, even more than the defeat itself, it was the speed with which Hannibal moved after Trebia that left the Romans scrambling. The Carthaginian general didn't linger after his victory. Instead, he continued to move south, staying one step ahead of the Romans, constantly keeping them on edge, forcing them to react rather than plan. Hannibal was playing a deeper game than anyone had realized. Rome, of course, would not back down easily. Even in the wake of the defeat at Trebia, the Senate quickly gathered a new army to face Hannibal, led by the consul Gaius Flaminius. This would lead to another fateful battle, one that would come to symbolize the brutality of this conflict, the Battle of Lake Trasimene. In June of 217 BCE, Hannibal once again used his cunning and knowledge of the landscape to his advantage. This time, he lured the Roman army into a tight, narrow pass near Lake Trasimene, surrounded on all sides by high hills and dense forests. The Romans, overconfident after their losses, were vulnerable to Hannibal's tactics. With his forces hidden in the hills, Hannibal set the perfect ambush. When the Romans marched into the pass, they were trapped. The battle that followed was a disaster for the Romans. They had no room to maneuver, no escape routes, and no way to form their famous battle lines. Hannibal's army, positioned strategically on the hills, surrounded them and attacked from all sides. By the end of the day, more than 15,000 Roman soldiers were dead, and another 10,000 had been captured. The Romans had suffered their worst defeat yet. Yet, for Hannibal, even with this stunning victory, there was one question that he had yet to answer: could he take Rome itself? He had crushed 2 Roman armies and embarrassed them in their own territory, but the heart of Rome, the city itself, was still out of reach. Carthage had sent him to fight this war, but the real aim was to bring the war to a decisive conclusion. The Romans, despite their losses, were not broken. They had an unshakable belief in their eventual victory. And while Hannibal had caused massive devastation, Rome itself had not been taken. It was clear that the conflict was far from over. In the wake of these crushing defeats, the Roman Senate began to question their previous tactics. Instead of fighting Hannibal head-on in a series of disastrous battles, they began to take a more calculated approach, one that would become known as the Fabian strategy, named after the Roman general Fabius Maximus. The Fabian strategy was, in essence, an attempt to avoid direct confrontation with Hannibal. Rather than engage him in battle on his terms, the Romans would wear him down by avoiding pitched battles and cutting off his supply lines. It was a strategy of attrition, designed to neutralize Hannibal's advantages without getting dragged into more disastrous confrontations. This approach would be frustrating for both sides, but it was a necessary shift for Rome. It was clear that Hannibal's brilliance could not be matched on the battlefield alone. Rome would need to outlast him. Hannibal's inability to follow up on his victories by taking Rome itself was a major blow to his plans. While his victories at Trebia and Lake Trasimene had severely weakened the Roman forces, the battle was still very much in play. Rome was not done. And while Hannibal's fame continued to rise, the Romans were regrouping, shifting tactics, and preparing for the next phase of the war. The Punic-Wars were far from over. And for both Rome and Carthage, the real test was still to come. After suffering 2 major defeats, Rome realized it had to rethink its entire approach to the war. The battle-hardened Romans were not used to defeat, especially not on their home turf. Yet, despite the shock of Hannibal's successes, the city of Rome wasn't falling apart. Far from it. The Senate, while shaken, wasn't ready to admit that they had lost. Instead, they turned to a new strategy, one that would make them dig in their heels and avoid getting caught in another bloodbath like the ones at Trebia and Lake Trasimene. This strategy became known as the Fabian strategy, and it would play a crucial role in the eventual Roman victory. Enter the general Fabius Maximus, a man who would become the face of this new approach. Fabius, though not a young man, was a shrewd and patient tactician, and his idea was simple: avoid direct confrontation with Hannibal's army. The Roman forces were, by now, severely outnumbered and outmaneuvered, so the key was to let Hannibal wear himself out. Instead of throwing Roman lives away in foolish frontal assaults, Fabius urged his fellow generals to keep their armies intact and harass the Carthaginians in smaller engagements. The Roman forces were to avoid set-piece battles, relying instead on ambushes and surprise attacks to weaken Hannibal's forces over time. It was a strategy designed to keep the Romans alive and avoid annihilation until a more favorable time for a final confrontation. Of course, not everyone was sold on this idea. Many in the Roman Senate were furious with Fabius's cautious approach. They were Romans, after all, the masters of military conquest. They had been trained to fight and win wars with strength and discipline, not by skulking in the shadows and evading battle. For a while, it looked like Fabius's tactics might be too much for the Romans to stomach. But the reality of the situation slowly began to sink in. Hannibal had decimated their best armies, and direct confrontation was no longer a winning option. Still, the Romans were proud and didn't want to look weak. So, even while Fabius was adopting his strategy of indirect engagement, other Roman generals sought out more direct clashes with Hannibal's forces. They were determined to show their might, and their impatience led to a series of less than successful engagements. It wasn't until 216 BCE that Rome would come to grips with the brutal consequences of fighting Hannibal's forces head-on. The Battle of Cannae would be the culmination of these frustrations and mistakes, a battle that would send shockwaves through Rome. Hannibal had carefully selected the site, positioning his army in a way that would lure the Romans into a false sense of security. The Roman consul, Varro, decided to confront Hannibal directly at Cannae, despite the cautionary advice of his fellow consul, Paulus. The result was catastrophic. Hannibal's forces were outnumbered, but their superior tactics and positioning completely overwhelmed the Romans. Hannibal deployed his forces in a double envelopment formation, a move so brilliant that it became a textbook example of battlefield strategy. The Romans, eager for a decisive victory, rushed headlong into the trap, and by the time they realized what had happened, they were surrounded. With nowhere to retreat and no way to fight effectively, the Roman army was destroyed. Estimates place Roman casualties at around 50,000 to 70,000, making Cannae one of the most crushing defeats in Roman history. What made the Battle of Cannae so devastating wasn't just the number of soldiers lost, it was the psychological impact. The Romans had suffered a blow to their very identity. They had prided themselves on their military superiority, and now their greatest army had been routed, humiliated in the open field. It seemed as though nothing could stop Hannibal now. He had achieved what no one had ever thought possible. He had shattered the Roman legions. In the immediate aftermath of Cannae, it appeared that Rome's fate was sealed. The Carthaginian general had not only crushed the Roman army but had also built a powerful reputation for himself. Hannibal's forces continued to roam freely through Italy, and Roman citizens lived in fear. The idea that Rome could be conquered seemed like a real possibility. Yet, while Hannibal's victory was impressive, it didn't change one crucial fact: despite everything, Rome still stood. The city itself, the core of the Republic, had not been touched. And therein lay the difference between Carthage's triumphs and Rome's unbreakable will. For all of Hannibal's success on the battlefield, Rome's resilience was beginning to show. In the wake of Cannae, the Senate did what it had to do: it reorganized, it rebuilt, and it began to restore the strength of the Republic. Rather than giving up, they dug in their heels. Despite losing so many soldiers, Rome refused to surrender. At this time, the Romans turned to their allies in Italy for support. Even though many of these allies were wavering in their loyalty after Cannae, the Senate was able to rally them with a common goal: survival. Hannibal's army, though brilliant, was still not invincible. The Romans needed only to hold on long enough to exhaust him. This is where Fabius's strategy came into play once again. The Romans had learned the hard way that they couldn't defeat Hannibal with brute force alone, they had to outlast him. And so, the war shifted in tone. Rome's approach became less about winning battles and more about grinding down the Carthaginian forces through sustained resistance. This new phase of the war wasn't glamorous. There were no grand victories, no heroic charges into battle. Instead, it was a war of attrition. The Romans harassed Hannibal's forces, cutting off their supplies, and launched small-scale raids whenever possible. Slowly but surely, the Romans were wearing down Hannibal's ability to continue the campaign. The war had become a test of endurance, and it was clear that the Romans had more of it. Meanwhile, Carthage's situation was becoming more desperate. Hannibal, brilliant as he was, needed reinforcements to keep up the pressure on Rome. However, the Carthaginian Senate, back in North Africa, was hesitant to send additional troops or resources. They had their own concerns at home, and despite Hannibal's requests, they couldn't afford to drain their resources even further. Hannibal was, in essence, fighting Rome with one hand tied behind his back. While he had conquered and terrorized much of Italy, the absence of reinforcements left him unable to press the advantage further. As time went on, Rome's resolve held firm, and Hannibal's position became more tenuous. His campaign was taking a toll not just on the Romans, but on his own army as well. The war had gone on for years, and the Romans were learning to adapt to his tactics. Carthage, despite its early successes, found itself slowly running out of steam. But the story was far from over. Despite the difficulties Hannibal was facing, there was still much to play for. The Second Punic War was heading toward its critical juncture, and Rome's endurance would soon face its greatest challenge. The Romans, having endured one devastating defeat after another, were learning something crucial during the long grind of the Second Punic War: the value of patience and persistence. Hannibal, meanwhile, had hit a bit of a wall. Despite his brilliance on the battlefield, he was starting to feel the weight of his long campaign in Italy. His forces had been in enemy territory for years, far from their supply lines and reinforcements. He was stuck in a war of attrition, a kind of stalemate that he couldn't quite break. Rome, after the horrors of Cannae, had taken to heart the lessons of patience. The Senate, after the carnage of the battle, realized they had to outlast their opponent. No single Roman victory would wipe out the Carthaginian threat entirely. The war would need to be won not in one fell swoop, but over the course of many small engagements, just as Fabius Maximus had suggested. And while Rome was slowly rebuilding its strength, Hannibal's inability to decisively win the war was slowly starting to take its toll on him. By 211 BCE, nearly a decade after Hannibal's stunning invasion, the Romans had realized that they couldn't just wait for him to leave Italy. They had to push back, and they had to do it in a way that would force Carthage into a defensive posture. While Hannibal had been tying up Roman legions in Italy, the Romans decided to shift their focus on defeating Carthage's holdings elsewhere, and in particular, to take the fight to Spain. Why Spain? Because it was the primary source of reinforcements for Hannibal and the Carthaginian military. It was a crucial strategic location for Carthage, one that provided both resources and troops. The Roman Senate made the decision to send an army to Spain to sever the supply line to Hannibal's forces. The key to success was to crush the Carthaginian presence there before it could reinforce Hannibal's army. This was where the Romans' slow and methodical approach was paying off. Rome wasn't looking for a spectacular victory but rather a gradual suffocation of Carthage's power. In 211 BCE, the Romans sent an army under the leadership of two generals, Publius Cornelius Scipio and his younger brother, Gnaeus Scipio. The Roman goal was clear: cut off Carthage's access to Spain and its resources. The Scipio brothers managed to inflict serious damage to Carthaginian forces in Spain, forcing Carthage to make significant adjustments. This was a major step in turning the tide of the war. But, as we've seen before, even the best-laid plans don't always go off without a hitch. In 211 BCE, tragedy struck the Roman army. Both Scipio brothers were killed in battle. The loss could have sent Rome spiraling into despair. It was a terrible blow, one that could have turned the tide back in Carthage's favor. But Rome, relentless as ever, turned that setback into a new opportunity. Enter Scipio Africanus, the son of Publius Scipio. The younger Scipio, in his late 20s, was untested on the battlefield but had the full backing of Rome. His ambition was clear: he intended to continue the work his father had started, and he would not let the Roman Republic fall to Carthage. What made Scipio different from his predecessors was his understanding that the war needed to be brought to Carthage itself, not just to its soldiers in Spain. His eyes were now set on North Africa, and he had one target in mind: Carthage. Scipio's rise was nothing short of spectacular. At a time when the Romans were licking their wounds, he took the initiative and moved forward with a campaign that would eventually bring the war to an end. But before he could do that, he needed to tie up some loose ends in Spain. He needed to completely neutralize the Carthaginian forces there, and he knew that the key to doing so lay in their stronghold of New Carthage, modern-day Cartagena. New Carthage was a city of strategic importance to the Carthaginians. Situated on the southern coast of Spain, it was a major naval base and commercial center. Scipio's boldness and innovative thinking paid off. He managed to outmaneuver the Carthaginian forces, and after a series of brutal engagements, he successfully captured New Carthage in 209 BCE. This victory was a turning point. It not only crippled Carthage's hold on Spain but also sent a message: Rome was back on the offensive. But Scipio wasn't done yet. With Spain largely under Roman control, he turned his focus back to Hannibal. His new strategy was daring: take the fight to Carthage itself. By doing so, he could cut off Hannibal's ability to continue the war in Italy. Scipio's audacity was matched only by his tactical brilliance. Rather than waiting for Carthage to make the first move, Scipio took the initiative and prepared to take on Hannibal's fatherland directly. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Hannibal was still dealing with the challenges of his long campaign. Despite his brilliant tactics, his ability to take and hold territory in Italy had been stymied. He had inflicted enormous damage on Roman forces, but without the resources to finish the job, his ability to win the war outright was limited. He had been waiting for Carthage to send reinforcements, but those reinforcements were never enough. And despite his success in Italy, the Carthaginian Senate had not committed fully to his cause. The distance between him and Carthage's leadership was beginning to tell. By 203 BCE, Scipio's forces had reached the coast of North Africa. Scipio had learned from Hannibal's strategies and was fully prepared to bring the war to the heart of Carthage. It was time for the two great generals, Hannibal and Scipio, to face each other in what would be the defining moment of the Punic-Wars, the Battle of Zama. Hannibal's position was weakening. He had been in Italy for years, and his forces were weary. At the same time, Scipio's army was fresh, bolstered by resources from Rome and Spain. The stage was set for the final confrontation, a battle that would determine the fate of both Rome and Carthage. The Battle of Zama would be a monumental clash, one that would see the legacy of Hannibal and Scipio etched forever into the annals of history. But before we dive into that climactic moment, we have to take a closer look at the strategies, the armies, and the stakes that made this battle the one that would end the Punic Wars. As the Second Punic War dragged on, it was becoming increasingly clear that the showdown between Rome and Carthage would come down to one final confrontation, an all-or-nothing battle that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean world. This climactic moment would come at the Battle of Zama, fought in 202 BCE. The two generals, Hannibal Barca of Carthage and Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus of Rome, were about to face each other on the plains of North Africa. The battle was not just the culmination of years of warfare, it was the culmination of their entire legacies as military leaders. The stakes of Zama could not have been higher. For Carthage, the loss of this battle would mean the end of their empire. Carthage's forces were spread thin, their morale shattered by years of conflict. Hannibal, despite his brilliance, had been unable to break Rome's will to fight, and now he was on the defensive, fighting for survival. For Rome, a victory would mean the obliteration of their greatest rival and the consolidation of their newfound position as the preeminent power in the Mediterranean. This would be the battle that decided whether Rome would continue its expansion or whether Carthage would be able to rise from the ashes of defeat. Hannibal, by the time of Zama, had been leading his troops for over a decade. His army had marched from Spain to Italy, fought countless battles, and endured the harsh realities of war. His forces had shrunk over the years, a combination of desertions, the challenges of supplying his troops in enemy territory, and the lack of reinforcements from Carthage. His once great army was now a shadow of its former self, but Hannibal's mind was still as sharp as ever. He had a well-earned reputation for his tactical genius, and his strategy was to rely on his experience and the strength of his veteran troops to hold off the Romans. On the other side, Scipio Africanus had emerged as Rome's most capable general. His success in Spain had crippled Carthage's ability to reinforce Hannibal, and now he was ready to bring the fight to Carthage itself. Unlike many Roman generals, Scipio understood the importance of flexibility on the battlefield. He had studied Hannibal's tactics in detail and knew that to defeat him, he would need to outthink him, not just outfight him. Scipio's army was made up of well-trained Roman legions, but he had also recruited Numidian cavalry, which would prove to be a key factor in the battle. Scipio's ability to incorporate new tactics and make use of different types of soldiers was one of the reasons he had become such a formidable commander. The Battle of Zama would take place near the town of Zama, situated in modern-day Tunisia. The battlefield itself was relatively flat, offering little cover or concealment for either side. Hannibal, knowing that his forces were outnumbered and had less cavalry than Scipio's, positioned his troops carefully. He placed his elephants at the front, hoping that their sheer size and strength would break through the Roman lines. Behind the elephants, he arranged his infantry in a dense formation, hoping to withstand the Roman charge. His cavalry was placed on the wings, ready to flank the enemy if given the opportunity. Scipio, on the other hand, had a different plan. Recognizing the threat posed by Hannibal's elephants, he ordered his soldiers to create gaps in their lines through which the elephants could pass harmlessly. The Roman soldiers were well trained to deal with cavalry and infantry, but the elephants presented a unique challenge. Scipio's cavalry, which included the Numidian horsemen under the leadership of Massinissa, would be crucial in this fight. Massinissa, a former ally of Carthage who had defected to Rome, had a deep understanding of Hannibal's tactics and would play a critical role in the battle. As the battle began, Hannibal's elephants charged toward the Roman lines, as he had hoped. The Romans, however, were prepared. They quickly opened gaps in their formation, allowing the elephants to pass through without causing significant damage. The Roman infantry, following their training, turned to face the oncoming Carthaginian soldiers with precision and discipline. The Carthaginian infantry, although fierce and experienced, was soon engaged in a grueling battle against the Roman legions. Hannibal's strategy, which had relied so heavily on breaking through the Roman lines with his elephants, was quickly losing its effectiveness. Meanwhile, on the flanks, the cavalry battle was raging. Scipio's Numidian cavalry, superior in speed and maneuverability, proved to be the decisive factor in the battle. As Hannibal's cavalry was pushed back, Scipio's horsemen were able to encircle and flank the Carthaginian army. This not only disrupted Hannibal's infantry but also forced him to divide his attention between two fronts. The loss of his cavalry was a severe blow to Carthage's chances of victory, and soon Hannibal's forces began to collapse under the pressure. By the end of the day, the battle was won. The Carthaginian army, having been outmaneuvered and overwhelmed on both the ground and in the air, was decimated. Hannibal's forces, which had once seemed invincible, were shattered. The victory at Zama was a turning point, marking the end of the Second Punic War. Hannibal's dreams of revenge against Rome were dashed, and Carthage's fate was sealed. Scipio's victory would cement his legacy as one of Rome's greatest generals, earning him the title Africanus for his triumph in North Africa. The Battle of Zama had a profound impact on both Rome and Carthage. For Rome, it was the moment they had been waiting for. The defeat of Carthage meant that their empire would continue to expand, and their dominance of the Mediterranean was secure. It was a testament to the resilience of the Roman Republic, which had endured tremendous hardships and setbacks but had never lost its will to fight. The victory also marked the end of the Second Punic War and began the process of Rome's transformation into a full-fledged empire. For Carthage, the defeat at Zama was catastrophic. Carthage's once mighty military had been shattered, and the city's future as a power in the Mediterranean was now in doubt. In the aftermath of the battle, Carthage was forced to accept harsh terms from Rome. The Carthaginian fleet was disbanded, and the city was required to pay a crippling war indemnity. Carthage's ability to fight back was greatly diminished, and its position as a major power in the Mediterranean was permanently weakened. But for the Carthaginians, the defeat at Zama was not the end of their story. Though their empire was no longer the dominant force in the Mediterranean, Carthage would recover in time. The city would rebuild its wealth and influence, but it would never again be able to challenge Rome in the same way. The scars of the Punic Wars would linger for centuries, and Carthage would be remembered as a symbol of resistance against Rome's rise to power. As for Hannibal, though his military genius had been proven time and time again, the war had ultimately ended in failure for him. After the defeat at Zama, Hannibal returned to Carthage, where he would attempt to play a political role in the post-war period. However, the Carthaginian government, crippled by its loss, was reluctant to embrace his leadership. In time, Hannibal would be forced into exile, but his legacy as one of history's greatest military minds would endure. For Rome, the defeat of Carthage meant more than just the end of a war, it was the beginning of their rise to unmatched dominance in the ancient world. Rome had not only survived the Punic Wars, it had triumphed, and its empire would go on to shape the course of history for centuries to come. The victory at Zama and the subsequent fall of Carthage marked a definitive moment in history, one that irrevocably shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean. With Rome's dominance secured, the Roman Republic began to turn its focus toward expansion in ways it had never imagined before. The Punic Wars, particularly the Second, had not only proven Rome's resilience and military prowess but also solidified its determination to become the preeminent power in the region. The Republic had emerged victorious, but it was now a new Rome, one that had tasted empire and would never again be content with merely defending its borders. The immediate consequences of the Second Punic War were severe for Carthage. The terms imposed by the Romans in the peace treaty that followed Zama were incredibly harsh. Carthage, once a sprawling empire, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The Carthaginian military was crippled, its fleet was dismantled, and its ability to wage war was severely restricted. Rome demanded a crippling indemnity, a vast sum of money that would take Carthage years to repay. The Senate in Carthage, while still technically maintaining its sovereignty, was now under the watchful eye of Rome. Carthage was, in effect, a subjugated state, though not yet destroyed completely. For the Romans, the peace settlements with Carthage provided the opportunity to solidify their control over the western Mediterranean. The destruction of Carthage's military might open the door for Roman expansion into territories that had once been contested. Spain, which had been a major theater of war for both Rome and Carthage during the Punic Wars, was gradually brought into the Roman fold. By 197 BCE, Rome had established its dominion over the entire Iberian Peninsula, a vital step in securing its western borders and ensuring its influence over Mediterranean trade. Yet, while Rome now stood at the pinnacle of power, it would be premature to assume that the Romans were in full control of their destiny. The Second Punic War, though a monumental victory, had exposed the vulnerability of the Roman Republic in profound ways. The Romans were no longer invulnerable, and their victory had come at a high cost. The war had left them with scars, losses of personnel, wealth, and resources, that would take years to fully recover from. But more than that, the war had made one thing glaringly clear: Rome could no longer operate as a simple republic. The vast territories it had acquired, the new responsibilities it had taken on, and the sheer scale of its military operations required a more centralized system of governance, one that would have to evolve if Rome were to continue its upward trajectory. At the same time, Rome's internal struggles began to surface more prominently in the wake of the war. The Senate, once the central governing body of the Republic, found itself increasingly divided between factions vying for power. This fracturing of Roman politics would eventually lead to instability, corruption, and a growing concentration of power in the hands of individual generals. The seeds of Rome's eventual transition from a republic to an empire were sown during this period, as the very victories that had made Rome great also began to highlight the tensions within its political system. On the other side, Carthage was not completely without hope. Although it had been severely weakened, the city was far from being wiped out. The peace terms imposed by Rome did not mean that Carthage was completely neutralized. Despite the restrictions placed on its military and political actions, Carthage still had wealth from its trade routes, and its people were known for their resilience. In time, the Carthaginian economy began to recover, and though they could not openly challenge Rome, they regained a degree of prosperity. The city slowly began to rebuild, its merchants trading once again across the Mediterranean, though always under the watchful eye of the Romans. Despite the initial Roman victory, the Carthaginians never fully surrendered their will to resist. In the years following Zama, Carthage focused on rebuilding its economy and military infrastructure within the limits allowed by Rome. However, the burning desire for revenge against Rome never truly faded. The story of the Punic Wars, which had taken place on such a massive scale, was far from over. It would take years for the full impact of the conflict to settle. Carthage would play a crucial role in Roman history yet again, albeit in a much more subdued and tragic fashion. In the decades following the Second Punic War, Rome's empire continued to grow. Its military power was nearly unmatched, and its political influence spread across the Mediterranean world. The Republic expanded into Greece, the Hellenistic kingdoms, and even farther east into Asia Minor. The conquest of Carthage's former allies and territories created a wave of Roman expansion that seemed unstoppable. Rome was no longer just the master of Italy or the Western Mediterranean, it was now on the brink of becoming the supreme empire of the known world. However, Rome's rise to power did not come without significant challenges. As the Republic expanded, it found itself embroiled in conflicts both within its borders and beyond. Rome's military and political system, once ideal for managing a small city-state, was beginning to show cracks. The very generals who had brought Rome to greatness, the Scipios, the Gracchi, and others, found themselves becoming more powerful, often at the expense of the Republic itself. The power struggles among the elite grew more pronounced, with generals seeking not only military glory but political dominance. The defeat of Carthage was, in many ways, the end of an era. With the end of the Second Punic War, Rome's power in the Mediterranean was practically assured. The Republic had passed through its trial by fire and had emerged victorious, but that victory set the stage for the internal conflicts that would eventually tear the Republic apart. As Rome became more powerful, it began to lose sight of the values that had made it great in the first place. And, as history would show, the rise of powerful individuals and military leaders would lead to the downfall of the Republic itself. For Carthage, however, the story was not yet finished. While Rome's victory had shattered the Carthaginian Empire, it had not completely erased the city's influence. Over the years, Carthage would rise again, not as a military rival, but as a symbol of resistance and a reminder of what was lost in the brutal clash between these two great powers. Rome may have destroyed Carthage, but it could never erase the memory of the Punic Wars, which had forever altered the course of history. Though Carthage would never return to the same heights, its story lives on through the lessons it left behind. The Punic Wars, and particularly the Second Punic War, reshaped the ancient world, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. For Rome, the victory over Carthage was only the beginning. The Roman Empire would continue to dominate the Mediterranean for centuries, but it would do so at a cost. The republic that had conquered the known world would, in time, collapse under the weight of its own success. And so, the story of Rome and Carthage ends, not with a final blow, but with a transformation, one that would influence the fate of entire civilizations for millennia to come. While the Punic Wars had undeniably shaped the Mediterranean world and firmly established Rome as the dominant power, it's crucial to reflect on the long-term ramifications of this rivalry, especially on Rome itself. The wars had not only redefined the geopolitical landscape but also began to lay the groundwork for Rome's eventual transformation from a republic into an empire. This transition wouldn't happen overnight, but the seeds of change had been sown in the aftermath of the Second Punic War, as Rome found itself struggling to adapt to the demands of managing an empire and an increasingly fractured political system. The Punic Wars had elevated Rome's military to an entirely new level. The Republic had won, but it had also become something it hadn't anticipated, an empire in the making. The vast territories Rome now controlled meant that the Roman military, which had always been the backbone of the Republic's power, would need to evolve to handle these new challenges. The legions, once designed for short-term campaigns, had become the world's most formidable fighting force, but they were now spread thin across an empire that required constant protection, policing, and conquest. This shift marked the beginning of Rome's military expansion and marked the first signs of tension between the Senate, the political leaders, and the generals who now had the power to influence Rome's destiny. The ability to project military power over vast distances, from Spain to Greece to North Africa, required significant resources, and the increasing reliance on generals to command these far-flung legions had unintended political consequences. As Rome expanded, so did the wealth and prestige of its generals. The battles of the Second Punic War, and particularly the victory at Zama, had created heroes like Scipio Africanus. While his brilliance had been instrumental in Rome's success, it also foreshadowed the future conflicts that would arise between military leaders and the traditional republican system of governance. The generals, now not only military commanders but also influential political figures, would increasingly use their legions to further their own personal ambitions, a situation that would eventually undermine the Roman Republic's traditional balance of power. Scipio's rise to power was not an isolated example. As the Republic expanded and its military needs grew, individual generals began to accumulate not only fame and wealth but also political power. Scipio's leadership would serve as a model for later Roman military leaders who sought both glory and authority, and his eventual return to Rome as a victor was not just about personal fame, it was about the role the military now played in the political sphere. With the rise of powerful military figures like Scipio, who was able to influence Roman politics and the Senate through his popularity with the army, Rome's political structure began to bend under the weight of personal ambition and military influence. But it wasn't just the generals who felt the changes. The common people, too, would see the impact of Rome's expanding empire. As Rome began to acquire more territory, the Senate's power started to diminish, and the traditional republican ideals of civic participation and shared governance began to erode. The wealth generated by the empire began to flow into the hands of a few elites, aristocrats, landowners, and military commanders, leading to increasing economic disparity. The common citizens, especially those who had been sent off to fight in distant wars, found themselves struggling to benefit from the empire they had helped to create. Many soldiers returned to find their lands stolen by wealthy elites who had profited from the empire's expansion. The result was a growing sense of discontent, which would later be channeled by figures like the Gracchi brothers, who would call for reform and challenge the elite's monopoly over land and wealth. Meanwhile, Carthage, though humbled and severely diminished, never quite gave up. While the Carthaginian military and political power were shattered, the city's role as a commercial hub and its ability to rebuild wealth allowed it to maintain a level of prosperity that still attracted the attention of Rome. For decades, Carthage remained relatively quiet on the world stage, but the city's economic recovery did not go unnoticed. In fact, the Romans, aware that Carthage was rebuilding, feared that the city might one day rise again and challenge Rome's dominance. This growing concern would eventually lead to the Third Punic War, nearly 50 years after the conclusion of the Second Punic War. Rome, by the late 2nd century BCE, began to view Carthage's economic recovery as a threat, even though Carthage was not a military rival at this point. The city's ability to trade, especially with regions like Spain and North Africa, gave it economic clout. Rome, having expanded its empire to include Spain and Greece, now found itself with a vast network of trade routes and resources that it sought to protect. The resurgence of Carthage, while not directly a military challenge, was viewed by some Roman leaders as a potential risk to Rome's dominance. Thus, in 149 BCE, the Third Punic War began, a conflict that would ultimately lead to Carthage's complete destruction. The Third Punic War was short, brutal, and merciless. Carthage, despite its relatively peaceful nature in the years following the Second Punic War, was unable to withstand the might of Rome, which had grown increasingly ruthless in its efforts to secure its power. The Romans, led by Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of Scipio Africanus, laid siege to the city of Carthage. After months of intense fighting, the Romans finally breached the city's walls in 146 BCE, effectively ending the Carthaginian Empire once and for all. The city of Carthage was razed to the ground, its people either killed or enslaved, and its lands salted to prevent any future recovery. This brutal destruction of Carthage marked the end of the Punic Wars. Rome had not only defeated its greatest rival but had also secured its position as the undisputed power in the Mediterranean. With Carthage destroyed, Rome now had no serious military rival. The political and economic systems in Rome would continue to evolve, but with no external threats to challenge its power, the stage was set for the rise of Imperial Rome. But while Rome triumphed in the Punic Wars, the path it would take from here was far from clear. The pressures of managing an empire would soon reveal the cracks in the Roman Republic's political system. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few elites, the rise of powerful generals who could command legions and influence politics, and the increasing reliance on military conquest to maintain Rome's dominance would eventually lead to civil strife. This would set the stage for the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire, as figures like Julius Caesar and Augustus would come to power, ending the centuries-old Roman Republic. The Punic Wars, and particularly the Second Punic War, were instrumental in shaping the destiny of Rome. They not only solidified Rome's position as the dominant force in the Mediterranean but also marked the beginning of the transition that would eventually lead to the rise of Imperial Rome. In a sense, Carthage's destruction marked the last chapter of an ancient world that would give way to a new era, one where Rome, now uncontested, would stretch its power across continents and create one of the most enduring empires the world has ever known. As the political and military structure of Rome evolved in the wake of its triumph over Carthage, the shift from republic to empire became inevitable. The victories in the Punic Wars had laid the groundwork for Rome's rise to dominance, but they also revealed the cracks in the Roman system, cracks that would eventually lead to the downfall of the Republic. Despite the overwhelming success that Rome enjoyed after its triumphs over Carthage, the internal pressures of governing a sprawling empire and addressing the needs of its diverse populations would become more complicated as the Republic's political machinery started to sputter and grind to a halt. One of the most significant long-term effects of the Punic Wars was the expansion of Rome's military might. Before the wars, Rome was primarily concerned with defending its territory and managing its alliances in Italy. The conquest of Sicily, Carthage's destruction, and subsequent territorial expansions after the Punic Wars meant that Rome now controlled vast stretches of land that stretched from Spain to Asia Minor, from North Africa to the southern parts of Europe. This sprawling empire required constant military presence and an ever-growing army. As Rome's territorial ambition stretched further, so too did the need for soldiers. The Roman military, once based on citizen soldiers who served for a limited period, began to change dramatically. During the Punic Wars, particularly in the aftermath of the Second Punic War, Rome had to rely more and more on professional soldiers who were not just defending their land but fighting for pay and land grants. These soldiers became loyal not to the Senate, nor to the Republic itself, but to the generals who paid and promised them rewards. This fundamental shift in the loyalty of the legions would become a central issue in Roman politics and would lead to the rise of military dictators, eventually paving the way for the fall of the Republic. The social and economic pressures within Rome were also growing in the wake of the Punic Wars. The conflict, particularly the Second Punic War, had devastated many of the small farms that had once been the backbone of Roman society. Many farmers who had fought in the wars returned home to find their properties in ruin or overtaken by large landowners, who now controlled vast estates. These large estates were worked by slaves captured during Rome's many military campaigns, and the reliance on slave labor created further inequality between the Roman elite and the growing urban poor. As the latifundia system expanded, small farmers were displaced, leading to the rise of a disenfranchised class that was no longer able to participate in the traditional Roman military or political systems. This class of impoverished Romans, now concentrated in the city of Rome itself, had few avenues for upward mobility. The plebeians, once the backbone of the Roman military, were becoming increasingly marginalized in the political process. The elite, composed largely of wealthy landowners, held most of the power in the Senate and in the consuls. Yet the plebeians, having fought and bled for the Republic in wars like the Punic Wars, began to demand reforms that would give them more of a stake in the system. These social tensions were compounded by the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. This period of social unrest saw the rise of reform movements aimed at addressing the needs of the poor. The most notable of these movements were the attempts by the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, to implement land reforms and provide relief for the dispossessed. Tiberius Gracchus, as tribune in 133 BCE, proposed laws to redistribute land to the poor, breaking up the latifundia and redistributing it to those who had fought in Rome's wars but were left landless. His ideas, however, were met with fierce opposition from the Senate, which was composed of wealthy landowners who would lose power and influence if such reforms were passed. Ultimately, Tiberius Gracchus was murdered by a group of senators, and his brother Gaius would meet a similar fate when he tried to expand on Tiberius's reforms. The murders of the Gracchi brothers, tragic as they were, marked the beginning of an era of political violence in Rome. The concept of political assassination, once thought unthinkable in Roman politics, became a tool used by rival factions to gain and hold power. What followed was a period of instability, where the Roman military and political systems began to shift toward authoritarian rule. The traditional republican system, in which power was shared between elected officials and the Senate, began to crumble under the weight of factionalism, inequality, and social unrest. In the midst of this chaos, military leaders such as Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla rose to prominence. Marius, a general who had served in the wars against the Germanic tribes, reformed the Roman army by allowing the landless poor to enlist as soldiers. This move dramatically altered the composition of the Roman legions, shifting their loyalty away from the state and toward individual generals. Marius's reforms created a professional army that would be loyal not to Rome itself, but to the generals who commanded them and promised them land and rewards. Sulla, on the other hand, would take things even further. Sulla was a brilliant and ruthless military commander who seized power during a civil war between his faction and that of Marius. After defeating his rivals, Sulla declared himself dictator for life and enacted sweeping reforms that strengthened the power of the Senate, while stripping away many powers from the popular assemblies. His rule was marked by political purges and brutal repression of his enemies, and it set the precedent for future strongmen to wield power through military force rather than political legitimacy. However, Sulla's reign did not last, and after his death, the stage was set for even greater instability. The Republic was now a shell of its former self, with generals and armies ruling more effectively than the Senate. The influence of military commanders would continue to grow, and with them, the likelihood of another civil war, one that would ultimately culminate in the rise of Julius Caesar. Caesar, a brilliant politician and military leader, seized on the chaos left by Sulla's reforms and the civil wars that followed. Through a series of alliances with other powerful figures, including Pompey and Crassus, Caesar built a political machine that rivaled that of the Senate. His conquest of Gaul and his subsequent return to Rome set the stage for a final clash between him and Pompey, the two leading figures of the Roman Republic. The Rubicon, which Caesar famously crossed in 49 BCE, marked the point of no return for the Republic. Caesar's victory in the Civil War led to his appointment as dictator for life, and after his assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was effectively over. The fall of the Roman Republic was thus not caused by any single event or individual. Rather, it was the culmination of centuries of social, political, and military changes, many of which were set in motion by the Roman victories in the Punic-Wars. The struggle for control of the Mediterranean, the rise of Rome as a global superpower, and the internal pressures of governing an empire all contributed to the decline of the Republic. The Republic's eventual demise would give way to the Roman Empire, ushering in an era of imperial rule that would last for centuries. Though Carthage was destroyed and its people scattered to the winds, the Punic Wars left an indelible mark on Rome's legacy. The memory of Hannibal, of his extraordinary leadership, and his ultimate failure, haunted Rome for generations. Yet, for all the suffering and destruction that came with these wars, the Punic Wars were also a defining chapter in the history of Rome, one that would shape its identity and its future as a dominant empire. From the ashes of Carthage and the victory of Rome, a new age would rise, one where military might, political intrigue, and the ambition of leaders would forever alter the course of history. As Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire, the ripples of the Punic Wars continued to reverberate through the fabric of Roman society and governance. While the conquest of Carthage and the eventual collapse of its power marked the end of one chapter, it simultaneously laid the groundwork for the next phase in Rome's imperial journey. The lasting consequences of the Punic Wars were not only military or political, they were cultural, social, and economic, shaping the very identity of the Roman people and influencing the way the Roman state operated for centuries. One of the most significant and enduring effects of the Punic Wars was the sheer scale of Roman military expansion. The Republic, once focused primarily on consolidating power in Italy, now found itself with vast territories scattered across the Mediterranean world. This included the newly acquired provinces of Sicily, Spain, and North Africa, as well as the eastern Mediterranean regions of Greece and Asia Minor. The need to control and defend these new territories led to the expansion of Rome's military apparatus. The Roman legions, once composed mainly of Roman citizens, now became a professional fighting force made up of men who, although loyal to their commanders, no longer had the same civic attachment to the Republic itself. The Punic Wars had been marked by Rome's ability to adapt and innovate on the battlefield. From the construction of an unprecedented navy during the First Punic War to the brilliant tactics employed by Scipio Africanus in the Second Punic War, Rome's military prowess had been forged in the crucible of these conflicts. This period also marked the beginning of the Romanization of conquered peoples. Rome, ever pragmatic in its dealings, incorporated many elements of conquered cultures into its own. The Carthaginian influence on Roman naval tactics, for example, was unmistakable, and the knowledge gained from fighting against one of the most advanced naval forces of the ancient world shaped Roman strategy for generations. Yet, despite the military success that the Punic Wars brought, they also left deep scars on Roman society. The wars had been long and exhausting, particularly the Second Punic War, which drained Rome's resources and cost the lives of thousands of soldiers. The toll on the Roman citizen soldiers was immense. For Rome to continue expanding, it increasingly relied on professional armies, composed not of volunteer citizens, but of soldiers who had enlisted for pay and rewards. These soldiers, motivated by financial gain rather than loyalty to the state, became more beholden to their generals than to the Senate or the people of Rome. The loyalty of the legions to their commanders rather than the Republic itself was a key factor that would lead to the eventual collapse of the Roman Republic. The political system, originally designed for a small city-state, could no longer manage an empire that spanned the Mediterranean. Rome's expansion created a class of military elites with vast personal power, which, coupled with growing economic inequality, made the republican system increasingly unstable. The power of military leaders such as Gaius Marius, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, all of whom commanded vast legions, demonstrated how military strength increasingly eclipsed political authority. The rise of powerful generals, who wielded personal armies, began to erode the republic's political structure. These men would wield their influence not as magistrates elected by the people but as military strongmen who controlled the army and used it as a tool to further their personal ambitions. This shift was a direct result of the changing nature of Roman warfare. As the Punic Wars had shown, warfare in the ancient world was as much about politics and power as it was about strategy and tactics. The Republic, as it had existed, could not survive under the strain of this new reality. The wealth and territory Rome had acquired during and after the Punic Wars were now seen as tools to be exploited by ambitious men seeking to secure their power. Another major consequence of the Punic Wars was the significant expansion of slavery in Rome. After the wars, particularly the Second Punic War, Rome's vast new territories flooded the Republic with slaves. As Carthage and other regions were conquered, thousands of prisoners of war were brought back to Rome and sold into slavery. These slaves worked the latifundia, large estates owned by the Roman elite, and provided the backbone of Roman agricultural production. The expansion of the slave population led to a significant shift in Roman society, contributing to the increasing divide between the wealthy and the poor. The urban poor, many of whom had been displaced by the expansion of the latifundia, found themselves in dire straits, dependent on the largesse of the wealthy elite. As slavery grew, so did the wealth of Rome's elite. The rise of powerful generals and politicians, many of whom had profited from military victories and the spoils of war, led to greater concentrations of wealth. The wealth generated by the conquest of new territories allowed the elite to further entrench themselves at the top of the social hierarchy. Meanwhile, the increasing reliance on slave labor contributed to the growing economic inequality. This divide between the rich and the poor would become one of the most significant issues in the late Republic, as the wealth of Rome's ruling class grew ever more detached from the needs of its citizens. The Gracchi brothers' reforms, which sought to address these issues, were ultimately unsuccessful, but their attempts to redistribute land and wealth reflected the growing dissatisfaction of the plebeians with the status quo. The tension between the ruling elite and the plebeians would only escalate in the years to come, eventually leading to the rise of populist figures such as Julius Caesar, who capitalized on the discontent of the lower classes to rise to power. The expansion of the Roman Empire also led to an influx of foreign culture and ideas. The Punic Wars had brought Rome into direct contact with Carthaginian culture, and the influence of Carthage's military and economic practices would continue to be felt long after the fall of the city. Additionally, as Rome expanded into the eastern Mediterranean, it encountered Greek culture and philosophy. This exposure to Greek thought would lead to a cultural revolution in Rome, with Greek ideas about art, science, and philosophy becoming widely adopted by the Roman elite. The blending of Greek and Roman culture would later be known as Greco-Roman culture, and it would become one of the defining characteristics of the Roman Empire. The Punic Wars also had a profound impact on Roman religion. Carthaginian religion, with its focus on sacrifices and rituals to appease the gods, was seen by the Romans as strange and foreign. After the destruction of Carthage, Rome's own religious practices were further refined and codified. The Romans began to place greater emphasis on rituals and ceremonies to maintain favor with the gods, believing that Rome's power and success were directly tied to the favor of the divine. Roman religion, which had been centered on the worship of household gods and ancestral spirits, now expanded to incorporate new deities and practices as the empire grew. In terms of military strategy, the Punic Wars set a lasting precedent for the Roman military's adaptability and innovation. Rome learned from its enemies as much as it did from its own successes. The defeat of Carthage showed the Romans how crucial naval power was to securing dominance over the Mediterranean. It also highlighted the importance of tactical flexibility. Scipio Africanus's victories, particularly at the Battle of Zama, demonstrated that even a general of Hannibal's caliber could be defeated with the right strategies. The lessons learned in these wars would inform Roman military doctrine for centuries, and their influence would be felt well into the time of the Roman Empire. As Rome entered its imperial phase, the echoes of the Punic Wars continued to resonate. The legacy of these wars lived on in the Roman identity, shaping the way Romans viewed their military, their politics, and their place in the world. The myth of Roman invincibility, forged in the crucible of the Punic Wars, would be tested many times in the centuries to come, but the lessons learned in these wars would shape Rome's future decisions, for better and for worse. The Punic Wars, for all their destruction and loss, were a crucible that forged the Roman Empire and sealed its place in the history of the world. After the Punic Wars, Rome entered a new and tumultuous chapter of its history. The destruction of Carthage marked the end of one era, but the challenges that arose in the wake of the Republic's victories over its greatest rival set the stage for the internal strife and political decay that would eventually lead to the collapse of the Roman Republic itself. The end of the Punic Wars left a vast, sprawling empire in need of a new structure, one that could not only govern the newly acquired territories but also address the growing dissatisfaction and unrest within Rome's own borders. Rome's victories in the Punic Wars had been hard-fought and costly, but they had solidified its status as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. With Carthage obliterated and its primary rival eliminated, Rome now stood at the pinnacle of power, with nearly every significant Mediterranean city-state and region under its control or influence. But even as Rome's political and military dominance seemed unassailable, the very triumphs that secured its place as an empire also sowed the seeds for future conflict. One of the most immediate consequences of the Punic Wars was the massive expansion of Rome's territory. The Republic, once a small city-state, had now become an imperial power with vast holdings that stretched from Spain in the west to Asia Minor in the east. The addition of these territories brought with it new challenges of governance, defense, and administration. Rome had to figure out how to integrate these new provinces into its political system without overwhelming the existing structure of the Republic. Unfortunately, the systems that had worked for a small city-state simply weren't equipped to handle such vast territorial expansion. At the heart of Rome's imperial ambitions was its military. The Roman legions had been the backbone of the Republic's success, and after the Punic Wars, they were the primary tool of Roman expansion. However, the Roman military system, which had once been composed primarily of citizen soldiers who fought for a limited period of time, was increasingly professionalized. Soldiers were no longer farmers or citizens fighting to defend their homeland, they were professional warriors fighting for pay, land, and rewards. This shift in the nature of Roman armies had profound implications for the Republic's stability. As Rome's generals became more reliant on a standing army of professional soldiers, they also became more reliant on those soldiers' loyalty. No longer could Roman armies be counted on to fight out of duty to Rome or its people. Now, armies were loyal to their generals, who controlled the rewards that soldiers could expect for their service. This loyalty to generals rather than the state would prove to be a major factor in the downfall of the Republic. Generals who had personal armies that owed them their loyalty could now use their military might to influence political decisions, pushing aside the traditional republican system of checks and balances. The expansion of the Roman Empire also had significant social and economic consequences. The influx of wealth from the newly acquired territories brought both prosperity and inequality. On the one hand, Roman elites benefited greatly from the spoils of war, accumulating vast fortunes through land ownership and control of trade routes. On the other hand, many Romans, particularly the veterans who had fought in the wars, returned to find that their farms had been taken over by wealthy landowners. These landowners had the resources to purchase large estates, known as latifundia, which were worked by slaves captured during Roman military campaigns. The shift from small family farms to large estates worked by slaves displaced many Roman citizens, who had once been the backbone of the Roman military. This growing inequality between the elite landowners and the urban poor in Rome led to social unrest. The newly dispossessed plebeians found themselves marginalized and without means of livelihood, and their growing resentment fueled the demand for social reform. Rome's political system, designed for a small city-state, struggled to manage the growing empire. The Senate, composed primarily of aristocrats, had traditionally been the center of political power. However, the Senate's control over the Roman government increasingly came under pressure as generals and military leaders gained more influence. The political elite's refusal to implement meaningful reforms, such as land redistribution, and their failure to address the needs of the lower classes only deepened the divide between the ruling class and the common people. This period of unrest in the Roman Republic was marked by the emergence of populist leaders who sought to capitalize on the discontent of the lower classes. The most famous of these leaders were the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius, elected as tribune in 133 BCE, proposed sweeping reforms to address the land crisis. He sought to redistribute land to the poor by limiting the amount of land any one person could own and by giving land to veterans. These reforms, however, were met with fierce opposition from the Senate, which saw them as a threat to their wealth and power. Tiberius was eventually murdered in a violent political clash, but his brother Gaius continued his mission, advocating for further reforms, including the extension of Roman citizenship to more of Italy's allies. Gaius Gracchus's reforms also met with resistance, and he too was killed in a violent purge. Despite their tragic ends, the Gracchi brothers' attempts to address social inequality highlighted the deep divisions within Roman society. The failure of their reforms only fueled more unrest, and political violence became increasingly common in Rome. The Gracchi brothers' deaths marked the beginning of an era of instability and civil conflict in the Republic. The political violence that followed the deaths of the Gracchi brothers laid the groundwork for the rise of military strongmen in Rome. As generals like Marius, Sulla, and Pompey rose to prominence, they increasingly used their armies to advance their own political agendas. This growing militarization of Roman politics undermined the traditional republican system, in which power was supposed to be held by elected officials who were accountable to the people. The shift in loyalty from the state to individual generals made it difficult for the Senate to maintain control, and the once stable political system began to fracture. By the time Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, the Roman Republic was in a state of near collapse. Caesar, who had gained power through military victories and political alliances, used his personal army to seize control of Rome. The Senate, once the heart of Roman politics, could no longer stop him. Caesar's rise to power was the final blow to the Republic, and after his assassination in 44 BCE, the transition to imperial rule was inevitable. Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir, would ultimately become the first Roman emperor, ending the Republic and establishing the Roman Empire. The legacy of the Punic Wars played a significant role in shaping the future of Rome. The wars had provided Rome with the military power, wealth, and resources needed to dominate the Mediterranean. But they also exposed the flaws of the republican system, particularly the inability to manage a vast empire and address the needs of a growing and increasingly discontented population. The political, social, and military changes that followed the Punic Wars paved the way for the rise of the Roman Empire and the eventual transformation of Rome from a republic to an autocratic regime. The transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire was not just a political shift, it was a complete reordering of the Roman world. While the Punic Wars had brought Rome unprecedented wealth and territorial expansion, the Republic's inability to manage such vast new holdings, coupled with its internal struggles, ultimately paved the way for the downfall of the republican system. The Republic's collapse would not be the result of a single event, but the culmination of a series of crises that had been brewing for decades, exacerbated by the tensions exposed by Rome's victory in the Punic Wars. The shift to empire was in many ways a necessary response to the challenges Rome faced after its overwhelming success in the Mediterranean. The Republic's political structure, designed for a small city-state, was simply inadequate for an empire that stretched across 3 continents. The Senate, which had held the reins of power during the Republic's early days, was no longer capable of governing such a vast and diverse empire. As Rome's borders expanded, the Senate's influence waned, while military leaders, who controlled powerful armies, gained more influence. The growing power of Rome's generals was one of the key factors that contributed to the collapse of the Republic. During the Punic Wars, generals like Scipio Africanus and Fabius Maximus had risen to prominence, leading Rome to victory against Carthage and consolidating its dominance in the Mediterranean. However, the loyalty of the legions was no longer to the Senate or the Roman people, but to their commanders. The professionalization of the Roman army, which began as a necessity in the wake of the Punic Wars, meant that soldiers now fought for pay, land, and personal rewards rather than civic duty. This shift in loyalty created a dangerous precedent. Military commanders who had personal control over their armies could now wield political power. Rome's military system had once been a tool of the state, but it had become increasingly militarized, with generals like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla leading armies that were loyal only to them. Marius, for example, had reformed the army in the late 2nd century BCE, allowing the landless poor to enlist as soldiers, which in turn created a larger, more professional army. This move allowed for a much more flexible and powerful military force, but it also made the army more dependent on the personal ambitions of generals. Marius's reforms paved the way for future generals, including Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, to build personal power bases within their armies, which ultimately allowed them to bypass the traditional political structures of the Republic. Sulla, in particular, set the stage for the future by marching on Rome with his army in 88 BCE, a move that had been unthinkable for any general up until that point. His ability to use military force to take control of Rome marked a turning point in Roman politics. Sulla's dictatorship, though short-lived, was an important precedent for future military leaders like Caesar. The power of the Senate was severely weakened during Sulla's reign, and the idea of using military force to settle political disputes became more entrenched in Roman politics. Meanwhile, Rome's economic and social systems were being stretched to the breaking point. The vast wealth gained through conquest had made the elite even richer, while the urban poor and displaced farmers were left behind. The growing gap between the wealthy aristocracy and the impoverished masses was a constant source of tension. With large estates, latifundia, worked by slaves becoming the dominant agricultural system, many small Roman farmers found themselves unable to compete. These farmers, who had traditionally served as soldiers in the legions, now struggled to make a living and were increasingly drawn to the cities, where they became part of a growing class of disenfranchised urban poor. This growing inequality led to a series of populist movements, most notably the reforms of the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, who attempted to redistribute land to the poor and address the economic disparities that were tearing Rome apart. While their reforms were ultimately unsuccessful and met with violent opposition from the Senate, they highlighted the growing tension between the elites and the masses. The failure of the Gracchi brothers' reforms was a clear sign that the Republic could not address the deepening social and economic problems that came with the expansion of the empire. These internal divisions, combined with the increasing power of the military, led to the rise of powerful leaders who sought to bypass the traditional political institutions of Rome. Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar formed the first triumvirate in 60 BCE, a political alliance that would dominate Roman politics for several years. However, the alliance eventually fractured, leading to civil war between Pompey and Caesar. Caesar's victory in the Civil War was the final blow to the Republic. In 49 BCE, when Caesar famously crossed the Rubicon with his army, he defied the Senate's authority and initiated a civil war that would end with him as the master of Rome. Caesar's appointment as dictator for life in 44 BCE was a symbol of the collapse of the traditional republican system. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE did not bring the Republic back. Instead, it set the stage for the rise of his adopted heir, Octavian, later Augustus, who would become the first Roman emperor. Octavian's rise to power marked the official end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. Augustus skillfully manipulated public opinion and used his military power to consolidate his control over Rome. He presented himself as the restorer of the Republic, but in reality, he had established a new system of government that placed all real power in his hands. The transition from republic to empire was not a sudden shift but a gradual process, one that took place over several generations. The Punic-Wars, while bringing Rome to the height of its military power, exposed the deep flaws in the Republic's political and social structures. The wealth gained from conquest, the professionalization of the military, and the inability of the Senate to adapt to the demands of empire all contributed to the downfall of the republican system. Under Augustus and his successors, the Roman Empire would enter a new era of centralized rule, one in which the emperor held absolute power. The Roman Empire would last for centuries, but the Republic, the system of government that had once been the pride of Rome, was gone, replaced by an imperial system that would dominate the Western world for generations. Even as the Republic fell, the legacy of the Punic Wars continued to shape Rome's destiny. The wars had forged Rome into a powerful military empire, and the ambition that had driven Rome to conquer Carthage would continue to drive its expansion. But the lessons of the Punic Wars also served as a warning. The cost of empire, both in terms of lives and political stability, would always be high. Rome's transformation into an empire was a direct consequence of the very victories that had made it a superpower, a reminder that the price of conquest could ultimately lead to the fall of a once proud republic. As Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire, the effects of the Punic Wars continued to shape the trajectory of the Roman world. The Republic, having survived centuries of internal conflicts and external wars, was finally stretched beyond its breaking point. The military expansion, the immense wealth from conquered territories, and the increasing dependence on generals for political and military power had paved the way for the imperial system. The Romans, though initially proud of their republican values, had begun to see those values as ill-suited to the needs of an empire. The Punic Wars, with their combination of military brilliance and sheer perseverance, had led Rome to a place where the republic could no longer function effectively. With the rise of the empire, however, came a new set of challenges. The transition to imperial rule was not seamless. The world that Augustus inherited was full of political, social, and economic strains that had been simmering for generations. Augustus, though hailed as the savior of Rome, was not the final solution to these problems. His reign established the foundation for the Roman Empire, but the institutions of the empire were built upon the fragile remnants of the republic's old structures. One of the immediate challenges that Augustus and future emperors would face was how to manage Rome's vast and diverse territories. The Punic Wars had laid the groundwork for the expansion of Rome, but the empire that followed was no longer a single, unified society. It was a collection of provinces, peoples, and cultures. The old Roman way of governance, which had relied on a relatively small senate and assemblies, was ill-suited to manage such a large and varied empire. Rome had a complex system of client kingdoms, provinces, and direct imperial control over different territories. Augustus's solution to this problem was to establish a system of provincial governors, who would answer to him directly, consolidating power at the top. However, this system also created tensions between the provinces and the imperial center, as local elites often resisted centralization and sought more autonomy. The growing complexity of governing an empire also meant that Rome needed a more efficient administrative system. While the Roman Republic had been able to function with a relatively small bureaucracy, the demands of managing an empire required a much larger and more sophisticated structure. Augustus's reforms included the creation of a professional civil service and the establishment of an imperial bureaucracy that would oversee everything from taxation to public works projects. While these changes helped streamline the imperial system, they also contributed to the centralization of power in Rome. The growing administrative apparatus often led to corruption and inefficiency, as local officials sought to enrich themselves at the expense of the people. Economically, the empire's vastness required a level of integration that the Republic had never needed. The Punic Wars had brought an influx of wealth from conquered territories, but by the time Augustus became emperor, the empire was facing the economic challenges of managing its immense size. The Roman economy, based largely on agriculture, had relied heavily on slave labor, which had been bolstered by the conquest of new territories. The expansion of the empire provided Rome with vast amounts of agricultural produce, which fed the urban centers and the military. But this economic prosperity was not evenly distributed, and the growing gap between the rich elite and the poor only widened. The urban poor, many of whom had been displaced from the countryside by the growth of latifundia, relied on the grain dole and public entertainment for survival. Augustus, aware of the unrest that simmered beneath the surface, instituted public works projects and games to placate the population. The infamous bread and circuses policy helped keep the people entertained and fed, but it also meant that the poor were kept in a state of dependency on the imperial government. The growing inequality, combined with the growing size of the empire, was a recipe for instability in the long term. Even more than these challenges, Rome's identity as an imperial power was continually tested. The transition from a republic to an empire was not simply a political shift, it was a cultural shift as well. Roman identity, shaped by the traditions of republicanism, had been founded on the principles of civic virtue and shared governance. The Punic Wars had fostered a sense of Roman exceptionalism, with victories over mighty foes like Carthage bolstering Rome's belief in its own invincibility. But with the shift to imperial rule, the traditional republican values were being replaced by the notion of Rome as a military empire. Emperors like Augustus and his successors began to cultivate an image of themselves as semi-divine figures, a direct departure from the values of the Republic, where power was meant to be shared among elected officials. This change in Roman self-perception was evident in the way emperors portrayed themselves. Augustus, who had been instrumental in the shift from republic to empire, used propaganda to solidify his power and present himself as the restorer of order. He portrayed himself as a bringer of peace after the chaos of the civil wars, but he also carefully cultivated an image of Roman strength and glory. Augustus's reforms, such as the creation of the Praetorian Guard to protect the emperor, the reorganization of the army, and the establishment of imperial cults, cemented the idea that the emperor was the center of Roman power. The Roman people, once masters of their own fate in the Republic, were now subjects of the emperor, whose divine status was increasingly emphasized. This shift in Roman identity was not without its consequences. As the emperors came to represent the divine will of the gods, they also increasingly became disconnected from the people they governed. The imperial system's reliance on centralized power meant that the fate of the empire was now in the hands of one person, and if that emperor was weak, corrupt, or incompetent, the entire empire could suffer. The Roman Empire would experience its fair share of emperors who were just that, weak, corrupt, or simply unable to manage the growing challenges facing the empire. Another significant challenge was the relationship between the emperor and the Senate. In the Republic, the Senate had held supreme power, but Augustus's reign fundamentally altered that relationship. While Augustus maintained the outward appearance of republican institutions, such as the Senate and the magistracies, the reality was that the Senate had lost much of its power. The emperor now had final say in matters of war, taxation, and foreign policy. However, Augustus cleverly gave the Senate some degree of influence, allowing it to retain its traditional role in the administration of the empire. This compromise helped placate the traditional elite while consolidating the emperor's power. But as the empire progressed, the Senate's influence continued to diminish, replaced by the increasingly autocratic power of the emperor. Despite the challenges, the Roman Empire continued to expand and flourish for several centuries. The influence of the Punic-Wars, which had thrust Rome into the role of a Mediterranean superpower, lingered throughout the empire's history. The wars had taught the Romans invaluable lessons in military strategy and governance, and the ambition that had led them to defeat Carthage was still present in their quest to conquer new lands. But the Punic Wars had also shown Rome the cost of war, the loss of life, the strain on resources, and the societal upheaval that came with expansion. As the empire grew, these lessons became more important than ever, as the empire sought to balance its military conquests with the need for stability, order, and the preservation of its very identity. The legacy of the Punic Wars, then, was a dual one. On the one hand, they brought about Rome's rise as a military and economic powerhouse, laying the foundation for the Roman Empire's dominance in the ancient world. On the other hand, they set in motion the internal conflicts and structural challenges that would eventually lead to the Republic's collapse and the emergence of an imperial system. The lessons learned from the Punic Wars, from military innovation to political adaptation, would continue to guide Rome as it navigated the complexities of empire for centuries to come. The end of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire left an indelible mark on the history of the Mediterranean world. Yet, despite the transformation from a republic to an empire, the legacy of the Punic Wars never truly faded. The battles fought against Carthage were not merely the struggles of the past, they were the blueprint upon which the Roman Empire would build its future. The Punic Wars taught the Romans invaluable lessons about military strategy, political maneuvering, and the harsh realities of imperial expansion. These wars, which once seemed to define Rome's struggles for survival, had evolved into something much more profound, a framework for the operation of empire. By the time Augustus, formerly Octavian, emerged as the first Roman emperor, the notion of Roman exceptionalism had taken deep root in the collective consciousness. Rome, after all, had been tested in ways no other civilization had ever faced, surviving the invasion of an enemy like Hannibal and later outlasting its Carthaginian rival. But this notion was also one burdened by the cost of imperial conquest. The Punic Wars, particularly the Second Punic War, had demonstrated to the Romans that military superiority, no matter how advanced, would not guarantee peace or prosperity. In fact, for all the glories of Roman military victories, the empire was plagued by the internal struggles that the Punic Wars had revealed. In the years following Augustus's reign, Rome's political system would evolve further, although not without tensions. Even though the imperial system established by Augustus appeared to restore order after the chaos of the civil wars, it could not undo the consequences of Rome's rapid expansion. The very imperial nature of the Roman Empire, which arose out of the ashes of the Republic, often found itself at odds with the principles of self-governance that had defined the Republic. Rome's vast territorial holdings, from the sands of North Africa to the frozen reaches of the Rhine, presented an almost insurmountable challenge for the emperors who would follow Augustus. One of the most enduring consequences of Rome's imperial expansion, as a direct result of the Punic Wars, was the establishment of an imperial system of governance that demanded a centralized power structure. Augustus created the Princeps, a system where the emperor held supreme control over military, political, and religious life, a sharp contrast to the Senate-based decision-making of the Republic. This system was later solidified under the reign of later emperors, each of whom struggled with the balance of power between the central authority of the emperor and the traditional influence of Roman elites. The expansion of the empire also meant a constant need for military campaigns, with the legions regularly sent to far-flung provinces to secure borders or suppress uprisings. The legacy of Roman military tactics learned from their battles with Carthage remained in force. The legion was the backbone of the empire, and the lessons of flexibility, discipline, and innovation honed through the Punic Wars served as the model for Roman military doctrine. However, this perpetual militarization came at a cost. The very foundations of Roman society were built on the ideal of civitas, that is, active citizenship, where each free Roman man had a stake in the decisions of the state. As Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire, fewer citizens had a direct role in governance, and the idea of loyalty to Rome was increasingly defined by military service. The professionalization of the military, which had first emerged during the Punic Wars, meant that soldiers were no longer drawn primarily from the ranks of citizens, but from the provincials and foreigners who served in exchange for pay, land, and citizenship. This shift, while making Rome's military stronger and more capable, also contributed to an increasing divide between the citizen class and those who fought and served in the legions. The Punic Wars had shown that the Roman military could not simply rely on citizen soldiers, and the necessity of creating a standing army of professionals became an integral part of the empire's long-term success. This, however, meant that loyalty to a general or emperor became a dominant force in Roman politics, ultimately diminishing the republic's governing structures. The result was a highly militarized society where generals, like Julius Caesar, could rise to power by appealing to their loyal legions and leveraging their military might against the traditional structures of Roman governance. Internally, the expansion of the empire also brought about the need for efficient administration, a demand that was only partially fulfilled. Provinces across the empire, while largely benefiting from the peace and security brought by Roman control, also chafed under the taxation and military presence that followed Roman conquest. While Augustus was able to maintain peace in the empire, the later emperors would find it harder and harder to keep the provinces content. Rebellions, uprisings, and border disputes became a frequent and often unmanageable challenge. The example of Carthage, which had been utterly obliterated in the aftermath of the Punic Wars, loomed large in Roman consciousness. Rome's victory over Carthage was a defining moment, not just in military terms, but in political philosophy. The complete destruction of Carthage, its cities burned, its people scattered, served as a reminder of the costs of imperial conquest. Though the Roman Empire would go on to expand and dominate, it was aware that such conquests had their own dangers. Internal instability, rebellion, and overextension were all risks that any empire had to reckon with. The imperial peace brought by Augustus and his successors, known as the Pax Romana, allowed Rome to flourish for several centuries. This period was marked by incredible achievements in architecture, engineering, culture, and law. Rome's impressive infrastructure, such as roads, aqueducts, and monumental buildings, bore the legacy of Roman engineering that had been tested during the Punic Wars. The Via Appia, for example, a road built during the Punic Wars to move troops quickly, continued to serve as a vital route for centuries after. Yet the empire that emerged from the Punic Wars and survived under Augustus was not a perfect one. The long-term consequences of imperial expansion, coupled with social inequality, corruption, and political instability, would continue to plague the empire for centuries. The very forces that had made Rome great, its military, its empire building, and its ability to conquer, would also prove to be the sources of its eventual decline. The empire would face further internal divisions, such as the crisis of the 3rd century, where civil wars, invasions, and economic collapse nearly tore the empire apart. The political system, which had once been a shining example of republican virtue, had now become an autocratic empire, dominated by powerful emperors whose reigns often depended on the loyalty of the military. As Rome continued to evolve, the lessons of the Punic Wars remained ingrained in its military and political culture. From the brilliance of Scipio Africanus to the resilience of Roman soldiers on the battlefield, the Punic Wars had shaped the Roman Empire in ways that were impossible to escape. Though Rome would eventually face challenges from within and without, the legacy of the Punic Wars remained a touchstone for Rome's identity as an imperial power, a reminder that no matter how mighty, an empire's survival depended on its ability to adapt and endure. As we reflect on the consequences of the Punic Wars, it is clear that the Roman Empire, for all its grandeur, was built on the shoulders of the decisions, victories, and defeats that defined those ancient wars. Rome, a city founded on its military prowess, had risen to dominate the Mediterranean world, but the cost of that rise would echo throughout its history, shaping the empire's political, social, and military systems for centuries to come. The story of the Punic Wars is not just the story of a battle between two great powers, it is the story of how the Roman Empire, for all its glory, was shaped by the forces of war, power, and ambition that pushed it from a small city-state to the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. End of script. Sweet dreams.